Why is it hard to regulate multinational corporations and foreign direct investment across borders? Well, before we answer this question, we first need to look at different types of MNCs and FDI. Then we'll look into some of the reasons for why it's hard to regulate these large corporations internationally through international efforts rather than just nationally. Um, and then I'll look into the two main types of regulation. One is through international agreements, trade and investment agreements, and second, through non-binding voluntary guidelines for these companies. So first we need to look into the diversity of MNCs. Obviously, we need to understand what we are regulating. Some of the MNCs are state-owned, say coming from China or from Saudi Arabia. So those might elicit more scrutiny from other governments. Some of the FDI are acquisitions. Those are also scrutinized a little more than greenfield investments, for example. Some of the MNCs are in very sensitive sectors, such as tobacco, where there's health effects on population. Some MNCs are very large, and then governments might be coordinating efforts in terms of preventing monopoly. So it's important to understand the diversity of MNCs before we look into the difficulties in regulating them. Well, individual governments have policies such as antitrust or acquisition screening. It's much harder to have these policies in international arena, kind of coordinated across countries. For example, with taxes, it took years and years for governments finally now trying to coordinate some of the policies preventing tax evasion by multinationals. And the reason was that some of the governments, such as Ireland or Singapore or Hungary, kind of benefited from having lower taxes and laxer rules and were not willing to sign on to these international agreements that would prevent tax evasion. There's also quite a lot of countries that are potential host locations for FDI. So to achieve an agreement is very difficult, even within, say, the European Union, which is an integrated entity. Some of the countries have different views, and the agreement was quite lengthy and difficult to be reached. So in terms of the two main types of international approaches to regulating FDI and MNCs, one is the multilateral trade agreements that are often now investment agreements about rules for FDI. In Asia Pacific, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and within that agreement, there's certain rules that were internationally agreed by these Asian Pacific countries for regulating MNCs. But then there's also a mechanism for settling disputes, investor-state settlement procedures. So, in fact, MNCs can also sue states if some of those rules are broken. So, the balance of power there is not completely tilted just towards the governments who can regulate MNCs, but the investors, the MNCs, can also sue states. Although this was somewhat reduced initially when the US wanted to join the agreement, the interests of the MNCs were to be protected even more than in the current Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And the last option is to have kind of more self-regulating guidelines. Sometimes they are initiated by international organizations. So the United Nations has the so-called Global Compact of good conduct by companies, including MNCs. And then the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has also guidelines for MNEs. But these are often not compulsory. It's kind of more often a bit of a PR effort on the part of companies to join those guidelines. And they are not always perfectly